Okay, let me say good morning and welcome. This is another roundtable edition of Denton's Smart Cities and Connected Communities think tank. Our topic today is ESG in the boardroom. ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. And we have some spectacular panelists today, which I think is reflected in the fact that we have several hundred participants joining. My name's Clint Vince, and I chair Denton's U.S. energy practice. And together with my dear friend and colleague, Emma Hand, we co-chair our 1,200 member global energy sector. And Emma and I also co-chair this think tank. Moderating our panel today is Gail Leone, who heads Denton's Global ESG Task Force. Gail also is co-chair of our law firm's D&I committee, Diversity and Inclusion Committee, which I think is possibly the best that I have seen anywhere. Before joining Denton's, Gail was the general counsel of Harley-Davidson. And before that, she was general counsel of US News and World Report. So she has literally seen it all, and none better to moderate our panel today. Gail asked me to also introduce two of our panelists who are very special friends of mine. I'll start with Paula Gold-Williams, who is the president and CEO of CPS Energy in San Antonio. Paula will be retiring soon, having won just about every award that a CEO could win in the energy industry. And we have agreed to give just very quick introductions so that the audience can really hear from our panelists. But Paula's won everything from Trailblazer of the Year for the entire energy industry, from S&P Global Platts to San Antonio Woman of the Year. She's a past chair of the San Antonio Chamber of Commerce. And a second very dear friend, Morgan O'Brien, is the founder and executive chair of the board of Anterix. Anterix is bringing private LTE networks to the utility industry. In a prior life, Morgan was the visionary who co-founded and led Nextel and really brought the first all digital wireless broadband network to the United States. Like Paula, Morgan has, and each of our panelists, Morgan has way too many awards to list, but I am going to quote my favorite for Morgan, which is one of the top US wireless innovators of all time. I think that's as good as it gets, Morgan. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gail to introduce two of her dear friends.
Great, thank you, Clint. It really is a pleasure to be able to do this. And I'll start with Peggy Kelsey, who is the EVP, General Counsel, Corporate Secretary, and Chief Compliance Officer, a mouthful of titles, for WEC Energy Group. If I slide into We Energy, it's because for 17 years I sent you checks monthly for my electricity. But WEC Energy is an American company based in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, with about 4.4 million customers across 4 states, Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, and Illinois. Peggy's responsible for all legal matters affecting the company, but for our conversation today in particular, she manages all governance matters and works very closely with the board of directors. And this is not the first company that has benefited from her guidance. She held the same position at Modine, Manufacturing in Milwaukee, where she also was the corporate treasurer, VP of finance and business development at different times in her career there. She also does serve on the board of North Shore Bank in Wisconsin, so we will get the benefit of her board service there as well. And Euless Payne is a board member of Peggy's board, WEC Energy Group, bringing to that role a very strong leadership and public service experience as a former securities commissioner of the state of Wisconsin, a partner in the law firm of Foley and Lardner, and president and CEO of the Milwaukee Brewers Baseball Club. And I guess we should probably do a shout out to our friends in Atlanta, right, for their win last night in the World Series while we're on that topic. Euless is now the founder and president of Addison Clifton. When I was at Harley-Davidson, we used Addison Clifton to help us with our global trade compliance. And in addition to being on the WEC Energy Board, Euless is also a director of Foot Locker and Manpower. And if you think baseball was Euless's primary sport, you are mistaken. He was on the Marquette's NCAA championship team in 1977, which was coached by Al McGuire. So that's probably one of the best awards you could probably claim, right? I thought I would start with just sort of a quick overview, building on what Clint said, sort of setting the stage for our conversation. In the 80s and 90s, we really started to talk about corporate social responsibility, sustainable development, triple bottom line. That evolved pretty significantly in the 2000s with the Carbon Disclosure Project and an early introduction of ESG as part of the UN Principles of Responsible Investing. I know when I was at Harley in the mid 2000s, we started working on our sustainable strategy and continued that journey as part of our 4 main corporate pillars. But since 2010, we've seen a much more comprehensive look at the focus on environmental impact and social impact and the need for governance policies, strategies, and disclosures to really drive better performance. Although some investors have been focused on ESG for years, 2020 and 2021 really thrust those issues into the spotlight in a new way. And it's not just instigated really by BlackRock's CEOs or letter to CEOs, but the 2021 proxy season saw more ESG-focused shareholder proposals than ever before, and they actually received higher levels of support. Board members now report that ESG is the #1 topic investors most want to discuss with directors during shareholder engagements. And in 2021, we saw a real shift in how boards are thinking about and addressing ESG. Most importantly, more boards are linking ESG to company strategy, which is really a positive development. And according to PwC's 2021 Annual Corporate Directors Survey, almost 2/3 of directors, about 64%, now say that their strategy is tied to ESG issues, which remarkably was a 15-point jump from the survey they did the previous year in 2020. And it's really sort of a strong indicator of how quickly things changed. More than half the directors also say that ESG is a part of risk management discussions, and ESG issues have a financial impact on company performance. So, and this is, interestingly enough, not obviously just a US board conversation. Is happening in boardrooms around the globe. COP26, timely this week, is really front of mind, and it's really evidence of the global significance of ESG. So what we want to talk about today is ESG in the boardroom, what those conversations are like, and I can't think of a better group of leaders to do that with. So I think to level set our conversation, I would really like to start by asking each of you from your unique perspectives to describe how you see this sort of growing pressure on boards, particularly in the energy sector, and addressing the environmental, social, and governance impacts across your operations that you're involved with. So why don't we start with Paula as the CEO of CPS Energy. because I know you're seeing this pressure growing across your operations.
Very good. Thank you so much. First, I want to thank you, Gail, and very nice to be on this particular session because it is so relevant. And of course, thanks to Clint and Denton's for always kind of giving us the opportunity to have really great conversations. So a couple of things I want to say. So I run a municipal entity, which I like to describe as a business owned by a community. And we don't have, we're not investor owned, and I defer and look forward to the comments from my colleagues here, but we do have bonds. The primary way that we fund all of our projects, and utilities need a lot of funding to effectuate everything, the capital program, the big strategies, our bonds are SEC instruments. And so the complexity of it does affect, I think, every aspect of our industry. And for utilities in particular, and when you're municipal though, we've been serving this community, particularly in San Antonio, for 161 years. And so we've grown with it. We are approaching 2 million people. When we started, we had about 8,000 people in San Antonio. So it's a very close relationship with our community. And we have extra pressures on us in terms of how we serve and how we connect and to our community. I think what's happening in our boardroom that's playing out, I think, everywhere is the intent and the aspects of really leaning into improving the environment. I think everybody embraces. We still have people who aren't really sure that they believe in climate, but the fact of the matter is I tell people that you can't deny the impacts that weather has had. And Texas, of course, just lived through Storm Uri, which was devastating, right, for San Antonio, devastating for Texas, something, people can't remember ever seeing as an impact of a system sitting on a state as big as Texas. The complexity that the board is dealing with, though, is the velocity of this change, right? Everybody is getting more and more aware that we need to speed up our efforts around the environment. But when you're dealing with what we call in the industry a brownfield nation, this infrastructure is already in place. These plants are already in their useful life. And board members have to also be thinking about how do you make sure that you get the right return, and not at the expense of the environment, but a return because you still have to be a business through the velocity of this change. And realizing that, my great, friend and colleague here, Morgan, is really trying to change the industry very much in terms of technology, but there are a lot of aspects associated with new generation that are not as mature as we need them to be. And you can't just power everything with just one type of energy. So we're naturally constrained by this challenge of not having all of the solutions at our fingertips, and also trying to figure out how to maintain that affordability for customers who do expect a better environment, a better climate. And they also expect you to make sure that you're not at risk for cyber and physical security threats, that you're keeping everyone safe. That whole issue of the aspirations, I think, by far outpace what's easily available to a utility that's trying to make a thoughtful change as fast as it can, and then deal with pandemics, the aspect of social justice, living through what I know we've all dealt with, the emotions of Mr. George Floyd's, experience. I mean, that has hit our world so fast. And what we want are solutions, and we want to be able to solve these issues easily. And I think I try to support my board as much as possible. I sit on other boards that really are talking about these issues, but they are just much harder to solve. And so for board members, I think it is going to continue to be one of the most important things to focus on, but the pathway for every single organization will be customized based upon your region, based upon the history, based upon your resources, based upon your community. There is not one way to get through this.
Absolutely right. And I think that's one of the reasons why having the different experiences in this roundtable will be helpful to talk about that. And Morgan, you certainly have been involved as a leader with public companies. And so those pressures are a little bit different from the standpoint, particularly of ESG performance as a criteria for investment, and how that might have a growing impact on your value preservation and creation. So if you could just talk a little bit about this whole issue of the pressures that you're seeing, that would be terrific.
Gail, thank you so much. And thank you, Dentons, and those I'm honored to share a screen with. What an opportunity. Let me introduce my view on this topic by way of a confession. I am now in the 30th continuous year of being on one or more public boards. So I certainly have my feet wet in that respect. And I have to say that for 29 of those 30 years, those principles that are captured down by ESG, environmental social governance, I would have, I think, respectfully brushed aside as not being core to what makes a business run. What makes a business run, I would have said, is absolute zero focus on shareholder return, everything else secondary. So that's my confession. For 29 years, I was aware of these other principles, not opposed to them, but did not embrace them. In the last year, for some of the reasons that I think you mentioned, Gail, that changed in my perception and in our boardroom and throughout society for many, many reasons, and you cited them. So I began to take ESG seriously, but another confession, I took the step, but I took the step in the wrong way. I was thinking of it as risk mitigation. In other words, it's crucial to look at these factors as a board and therefore as the overseer of management of a company to avoid risk in these areas. And that's true. But I've now come into the light, I believe, where I see that it is really more important as opportunity. And I think for any company, any board to really get there, you need an evangelist internally, someone who is knowledgeable, well-positioned, and tough enough. And in our case, it's our general counsel, who's the minority, female, and she has relentlessly, but with the greatest finesse, driven me and the others to where we now have a formal ESG policy, and we're putting substance behind the words. She would not accept anything less than that. And the way I would sort of round it out is to say that it is important, this is how I sort of communicate with my fellow board members, that brand perception requires an explicit embrace of ESG. And it's not going to be easy. And it has to be integrated at the exact same level as the other elements of our business plan. Now, having said all that, and I'll finish up here in 30 seconds. Having said all that, Anterix is at the heart of environmental and really at the heart of social, in that we're attempting to bring new technology into the utility industry and have had a lot of recent success. We're trying to marry new innovative technologies into making distributed generation a reality, broad scale reality, such that distributed generation, and less carbon can be consumed. So we have an easy job in the sense that our primary mission and the principles of ESG mate. But even with that, as I have confessed, it took an act of persuasion on her part, and an act of careful listening, which is not my natural instinct, to get to where we are now. And I would say we've taken good, constructive baby steps, but it's now right there in the boardroom with the governance committee, with your friend Singleton, McAllister as a board member, focus on it as equally as importantly as our other sort of what I would have described previously as our core business, but it's our spectrum business. So that's, I guess this was good for my soul, because my soul is feeling good.
Gail,
Gone to confession. I love it. That's great.
can I mention a couple of things I should have mentioned right at the very beginning? One is that we do have a Q&A feature for this Zoom call, and I hope that as you hear each of the panelists speak, you develop questions and feel free to put them into the Q&A feature, and Gail and I will monitor that. Also, please don't put them into the chat room, because at least my technological skill is limited to only being able to do one or two things at the same time. The second thing, Morgan, first of all, congratulations to Gina for bringing you along, not surprising, and congratulations to you for receiving that advice. But I will say that for really the past half century, the guidance for boards developed by the Nobel Prize winning Milton Friedman, Nobel Prize winning economist, was exactly as you stated, that boards were really to look at profits for shareholders and not other issues. It's wonderful that that is changing, but you are pretty much in lockstep with many, many other corporations. Gail, back to you.
Thanks. I will confess that I could not remember my college graduation speaker. And when Euless and my daughter graduated from the University of Pennsylvania, they had Denzel Washington, who was really fabulous as the speaker. But it spurred me to look to see who was my college graduation speaker, and it was none other than Milton Friedman. So when you say that, it just reminds me. But I do think the interesting two things that you said, Morgan, that I want to pick up on. One is that this is really an investment opportunity. And the interesting thing was not that it's important necessarily that Larry Fink agrees with you, but he said in his last letter to CEOs, we know that climate risk is investment risk, but we also believe that climate transition presents a historic investment opportunity. So it's exactly sort of that transition that you described, from looking at it just as risk to looking at it as opportunity. The second thing I want to pick up on is that you listen to your general counsel, and having been a general counsel, I appreciate that. And so I'm going to now turn to Peggy as a general counsel as it relates to her company, and as a senior executive in your company and as secretary to the board. How are these pressures surfacing as you're seeing it there, both at leadership level and in the boardroom?
Yeah, thank you, Gail and Clint. And I sort of, there are parts of me that just want to hit the mute button and listen to what everyone is saying, because it's such a privilege to be here. And I know my video seems to be getting a little wonky, so I apologize for that. I would say, so I'm 4 years into the utility world, having spent most of my years before that either in a law firm or at a global industrial manufacturer. And by the way, side note, shout out to all the Georgetown Law attendees. I have no idea why there are so many, but I'm loving my fellow Hoyas. So great to be with you.
And we have a number of Hoyas on this call.
Yeah, it's amazing. So I would say coming into the utility sector, one of the reasons why it's just so fascinating to me and in this role that I'm privileged to have as corporate secretary is that forever and ever and ever, the core mandates of the public utility are to provide affordable, reliable energy services to our customers. That is what we are here to do. That is what the commissions expect, demand of us. And that then started to evolve, as you pointed out, Gail, years ago. Of course, the environmental component was coming down, and the utility sector is right in the either in the spotlight or the crosshairs, depending on who you're talking to, of that discussion. And so that then layered in what we now say are clean. So we like to say our core mandate now is affordable, reliable, clean. ARC makes it easy for me to remember. And then on top of that, we have shareholders who are expecting a return. So as I speak to people about what does this mean for the utility sector, and I'm preaching to the choir, I know here, it is an incredible balancing act. And even in the 4 years that I've been here, there has been such a transition in the nature of the discussions that we are having with our shareholders. And I would say, as the corporate secretary, one of the really most interesting parts of my job is to participate in our outreach. We have very proactive ESG outreach with shareholders. So in addition to the normal outreach that you would expect us to have, we have ESG dedicated outreach with the ESG dedicated individuals at those shareholders. And it is our job then to translate that for the rest of the board into their responsibilities. And even in the last 4 years, those conversations have changed from the shareholders' perspective to initially very top down. Here's what we need you to do. Here's what we're worried about. We know it doesn't make financial sense, but we're out if you're in coal at all. To let me understand more. I'm going to put it this way. Are you transition ready? And is there, to Morgan's point, is there an investment opportunity with respect to you? And we're seeing that discussion shift. And so I would say that from my perspective as a corporate secretary, we're talking to more and more and more, even small shareholders, very small or small groups of shareholders whose voice has suddenly become much louder, whose power has become much greater, if for no other reason than when shareholder proposals are made, some of the very large institutional shareholders don't feel that they can say no to one of these proposals, even though they might not have made it to begin with. And it is our job to continually speak as management, and sometimes with board members, almost always with our chairman, to these shareholders, and then translate that into action. So to make sure that the board, that Ulyss, as chair of our comp committee, has call out agenda items that relate to ESG on his agenda, that the governance committee has theirs, that the full board has theirs, that audit has theirs. And that has taken on a life of its own. It's fascinating. I really enjoy it. But in the utility sector, it's been all about the E for a while, and I'm sure we'll get into this later. The S is creeping right up there, right behind it, probably as we're addressing the E. So I'll pause there for now, Gail.
Well, I think I'll go to Ulyss and have him comment from his perspective of being on the board and getting that feedback both from the shareholders as part of that outreach.
Okay, well, thank you, Gail. And Clint, Emma, and Morgan, Paula, thanks for allowing me to participate today. And I'm taking notes as I'm listening to everybody, so excuse me.
So am I.
Some very good tips. But I think from a director's perspective, it's an evolution. And I've been fortunate to sit on boards maybe starting in 2002. And one thing that, our job really is to fulfill our fiduciary duty, but that duty is changing, right? And the perception of our shareholders as to what that duty is also changing. So I think about the more questions, the question of materiality, right? When it comes to the effect on strategy, when it comes to SEC disclosures. We're seeing climate-related litigation. Even management, Peggy and the others coming to us and saying, look, here's how we're doing. The question becomes, how do we assess our management, right? We read a lot about it, but how do we know what are the metrics for our particular company in view of the entire environment? You see audit firms now saying we can give you this comfort letter. The more you pay, the more comfort you can get, so to speak. But what does that mean for us in our fiduciary duty? Committee structure, right? We talk about that. Where should it lie? It's a full board issue. One thing that we try to do over time and different boards I'm on is think of it differently. ESG acronyms are so easy to throw around, but they all mean different things to different people. As Peggy was saying, the E was big for us, but yet S and G is there too. So we talked about in certain terms like planet, people and prosperity, right? And then principles of governance, because ESG is so easy to throw out and kind of lump everything together. And so try to break it out to make it more meaningful to the board individually as directors. What are we really saying? Science-based target initiative, right? What does that mean? You follow the science, or you're really going to follow the science? Or do we find folks say, well, net zero by 2050? Well, one of the boards I'm on, we're challenging ourselves. We want to do it sooner. We just got validation on our submission by SBTI just this week on one of the companies. Big thing for us that in fact our screening, our sort of baseline calculation, our we call net zero mapping, how are you going to get there? And then you submit for validation to say if we're off our rocker or not. So that validation really helped us. And now we will drive it even further. And we're finding that the marketplace, if you say you'll get there before 2050, the market reacts. So does that become an influence on the company's strategy, like how the pace of this change? So I think that, again, as a board member, we're moving to on what should that standard be. But as we see litigation creep up, I think you've seen the SEC and over in Europe in particular, focusing on the investment advisors who are designating companies as green, right, as sustainable. And that affects the capitalization of these companies and the values of pension fund investors. So for us, it's really trying to get a sense of this moving target, bring it back to our particular company, which relates to our particular fiduciary duty. So materiality assessment, disclosures, litigation, but it's science-based targets. But the other pieces have to be, the effect on strategy, in my view. Because as a director, right, one of the things we primarily do is we listen to the strategy, poke and pull it, push it, adopt it, commit the funds to implement the strategy, and then hold management accountable for the performance of the strategy. But the effect of ESG on strategy is still yet unclear, right? We can project, but it's really hard to say. So again, I will end my comments there just by saying, I feel we're still in a learning curve. And I think the point of what should the metrics be for the board as it relates to compensation, tying it, like I chair a comp committee, tying it to compensation, can we really tie it that way? Or is total shareholder return what it's all about? So again, overall, I'm interested in hearing the comments and thoughts of those who participated today so I could take some more notes.
Well, that's good because I'm going to follow up with a question about measurement. So that's terrific. And I know that just one thought that Jonas Priesing, who's the CEO of Manpower, on whose board you sit, would be very happy to know that you're basically channeling his comments about working to change the world plan is about collectively caring for people and planet with new awareness and urgency. So I'm sure he'll be happy to know that. But you raised a really important point, and I do want to follow up with everybody about that. As we sort of become immersed in ESG, we really do quickly grasp that a core aspect is measurement. And some companies are sort of setting, measuring their performance against metrics of their own choosing. Others are are measuring against metrics or standards that have been or will be set by others. We know that we're going to see more coming from the SEC later this year. Or some companies have opted to do third-party certification, similar to what you're talking about. So there is, as you know, there's no one clear path really in almost every industry with every company. And our European counterparts are sort of ahead of us in this space, as we know and as you mentioned, particularly around climate change and supply chain, the new German law on that issue, diversity and modern slavery, anti-trafficking. We'll likely see more regulation here on this measurement issue. Some companies who are headquartered in California are having to deal with that now. So what would be really helpful, I think, and I know it would be helpful for me, would be to talk a little bit about what metrics you think make sense for energy companies to track, demonstrate, and really report on as to their ESG credentials, because I think this is actually, you've raised probably what is the most significant, or one of the most significant issues that I know that some of our clients are sort of grappling with. So maybe if I go back to Paula to talk a little bit about that and how you're measuring success. What does it look like for you?
That is a wonderful question. I'll tell you a couple of things from our perspective. One of the challenges, right, that everybody's going through is, what's again, is it a linear path? I absolutely don't think it's a linear path. I don't think you can say it's, and that it won't change. I think it's a very, we have a flexible path strategy where we're saying we're reacting to the innovations that are coming out. We're reacting to customer preferences. We're reacting to how fast the weather impacts are happening and how significant they are. And so we're struggling a bit in this space. I would also say, though, that a lot of times when we're dealing with customers and stakeholders on the environmental side, they'll say things like set a goal, right? The goal that you want to set is close all your fossil plants, in particular coal. That we can do. We closed 2 of our units 15 years early in 2018. The issue is the youngest plant we have is a coal unit. And so we know we ultimately need to take that unit, and is it closure or is it conversion on the pathway to getting completely out of coal? And we kind of think it's the latter, so that we can maintain service to a community that is growing. So when you still have the obligation to supply the power, it is very hard to be sweeping. So we get in the discussion, getting back to the board, we get in the discussion about, can you just set a policy and a goal, and that becomes your metric for improvement? Being a CEO, I would say great conversation. You can give me a goal to get out, but I'm going to have a lot of additional goals between now and 2050, 2040, and 2030, and targets. We are measuring things, though, that are not just goal related. We're measuring how much are we reducing our emissions, and how much are we able to change how we're affecting the effluent reduction impacts. How much can we actually make progress? And so we're looking very much at lots of different steps in between, progressive increases over a time. And then we look at that long-term goal at milestones 2050, 2040, and 2030, and try to keep measuring to the goal. But I would say, as a CEO, the goal is not the metric. The metric, again, is the reduction and the ability that we have to both reduce our emissions and impacts to the environment very meaningfully every single year, set those out there. Also, what we have a big energy efficiency and conservation program. And that's another great example. We had a goal to replace the energy demand that would be equivalent to a power plant. And so power plant, a big one, 800 megawatts or so, we wanted to be able to reduce our emissions through energy efficiency and conservation. And while that was a goal, in between what we were really measuring is how much each program was contributing to the elimination of demand in our system. How could we use our thermostat program? How could we use our demand response program and keep growing it? And we have one of the biggest contributions in the state, where we can, even during Storm Uri, make a measurable impact to bring absolute reduction demand on the system. So that's kind of way that we're looking at it broadly. We can set those goals, but the metrics look more like meaningful, sustained improvement, both in terms of how people are using energy, how fast we're putting clean energy on the grid. We have we've been in wind for 20 years. We now do global searches for additional investors in solar. And we are looking for partnership that's in a meaningful way. We did that back in 2012, where we did a big global project. Now we're doing another one. We have a flex power bundle. So those metrics are kind of set in to be annual drivers, and we couple those with the goals to make them work. And hopefully that's helpful to people.
That's terrific. Thanks. That's really helpful to sort of understand that framework. Morgan, how are you looking at this issue of measurement? I'd be curious from your company's standpoint, because you're sort of in the adjacent space to energy. And one question I'd love to get your thoughts about. There was a big article in the New York Times this morning. Actually, it's fascinating. On the first page of the business section of the Times, about 3/4 of it was devoted to energy related issues, ESG issues, but one related to supply chain and whether the measurement should include just your direct impact on the environment, or whether you should also be measuring what your supply chain is doing relative to that.
Well, let me first say that when I talk to our employees, we're small, we have about 80 employees. When I talk to our employees, I say, when you wake up in the morning and you're combing your hair and you're brushing your teeth, look in the mirror as you're preparing yourself for the day and say, everything I do is going to have a direct impact on making America a safer, better place to work, because we're helping improve the electric grid, than which there is no more important element of society. So we have that great inspirational, true message to psych ourselves up, and we're so happy. It's so lucky for me at this point in my career, which is obviously nearer the end than the beginning, to be working on something as important and as exciting. I looked at our ESG plan at Anterix that was adopted, the first we ever had, adopted after being crafted and promoted by our general counsel. And for example, of the 4 goals for this year, diversity in recruitment is one. Well, that's 100% measurable, totally explicit. Next year, when we look at it, if we haven't made any improvement, it's obvious to ourselves and anybody else who looks that we haven't. So I think metrics, measurement, of course, if you're not measuring it, you're not managing it. Another is, and that's on the social side. On the governance side, we're talking about a cybersecurity resilience plan for us and beyond us for our customers. That's the how do we participate as citizens in the overall process of defense against cyber attacks, which, talk about the New York Times, you can scarcely read a New York Times that doesn't have some warning about it. So there are 2. We can, if we develop the plan, we develop the plan. If we don't develop the plan, well, there's a metric. So these are real. These require money and effort and discussion they clamor for attention in the budget discussions just as much as hiring 3 new sales engineers. And even though, and I'll finish on this note, I mean, I'm the founder of the company, significant shareholder in the company, was the CEO of the company until recently, and now I'm the executive chairman of the company. So I have some influence over the board members. But I'm telling you that, and this is the burden we all share, it's tough. It's tough to say, now we're going to talk about these ESG issues and get the same level of attention that I get from reporting on current sales activity. It's not easy. And then, I did want to mention this. This is a completely unpaid testimonial. I was given to read, and I recommend to anybody, PricewaterhouseCoopers has a white paper called ESG Oversight, Corporate Director's Guide. I mean, that thing is dense, but very valuable. I awarded it the read it 3 times award, and I still have a long way to go, but that thing is good.
We, Morgan, we actually produced one. It's on our global ESG website that is not as dense on what boards, directors, and GCs need to know about this. But the one point I think that you were talking about, I think is really important, is this strategy element. Because if you build ESG into as a lens in your decision-making in the company, then obviously capital allocation will follow that. And the budgetary issue which you talked about, if it's dealt with sort of over on the side, it's going to be like a separate issue, and then you're not going to get the traction.
We all know the difference between talk and walk, and it reflects in the numbers what you're authorized to spend and what you can use, even more precious, which is senior management time.
Yeah, exactly.
Morgan and Gail, very quick question. Several people have written in questions, and they're asking whether your policy, your ESG policy, is available. Is it on your website, or can you speak with Gina and see if you're able to share it?
That's an incredibly interesting question, and I don't know the answer, because I can see an argument why it might be and why it might not be, but I think I could probably tip the scale if it wasn't, and it'll be on there. So keep an eye out for it on Enterix.
Okay, thanks.
And that raises a good issue about disclosure, and Peggy, I'll talk to you about that, because obviously from a general counsel perspective, that is something that you're involved in, both from management as well as working with the board on disclosure around this. So I'd be curious how you're managing that, because there seems sometimes obviously concern on the part of companies, are we creating more liability related to what we're saying in connection with this? And yet it's important for us to set targets to, move the company forward. So that balance is, I know, a challenge sometimes. So your thoughts about that would be really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's becoming more and more interesting, the disclosure subject. So if you could see my desk here, you literally would see, let's see, I've got our ESG Outreach deck. I have our corporate responsibility report. I have our climate report. I could keep going on. And of course, this is what the SEC is getting interested in, is we disclose all of these things that we would put in the sort of ESG realm or sustainability. And then I'll say also, we have the required SEC filings if you're a public company. And the SEC is now in an active campaign of issuing comment letters to certain companies saying, we're noticing certain things in your non-required filings over here that we might consider to be material risks. Why aren't those in your 10Q, 10K, et cetera? So that is something we are literally actively kind of comparing the two. And we feel good about where we are. But I would say, to your point, Gail, and this is something that's been a real interesting revelation. As I mentioned, I love these ESG outreach meetings with our very large institutional shareholders and very small shareholders, because they tell you things. They literally will say, for example, we have a question about your political activity, and do you know that you're getting dinged on the Zicklin index because it takes more than 2 clicks from your homepage to get to your disclosure about political spending? This was one of our largest institutional shareholders who told us this, and we didn't know. And so we were able to immediately fix that part of our disclosure. But as I said, they will tell you things. We have very robust disclosure. And with respect to the board, we share those disclosures in advance with the board and have them look over it. I'll give you a recent example. This is something I think is about to start getting measured hard by the external stakeholders. So as I'm sure many of you know, last year, not even a year ago, State Street came out and basically said, hey, folks, if your EEO1 report is not publicly disclosed, we're going to start holding you accountable. We're going to ding you for it. And so we looked and said, okay, all right, we need to disclose this, and we're not ashamed to disclose it. We're perfectly happy to do it. But we created our disclosure and we shared it with the board, with the comp committee, and said, hey, take a look at this, because the comp committee is the one primarily responsible for human capital management. Take a look at this. We want to share with you where we are here. But those numbers are now going to be out there so that folks can compare them one against each other. And one of the things that we did notice, as I mentioned earlier about this sort of transition readiness, was we are able to have more in-depth conversations with our shareholders and with our board members about that, the measurement of the environmental goals in particular, and how it translates itself into our compensation program. And to the point about investing capital, I will say, side note, it was quite a shocker to me when I came into the utility spend, and CapEx was a good thing because I came out of, global industrial manufacturing where CapEx, get that down. Whereas in the utilities space, you earn a return on prudently invested capital. And so we now, in our latest GSG disclosure book, which is available on our website, by the way, you will see what I'm now calling our ESG instead of Plan FAN, because it literally is a visual that looks like this, where we are literally connecting the dots between our some of our social strategy and some of our environmental strategy to those incentive plans. And Ulyss, as chair of the comp committee, has been integrally involved in our discussions about this. We have had social metrics in our compensation plan for 15 years. We just didn't call them that. And all of a sudden we were getting questions about, well, you don't have ESG metrics in your comp plan. And all of a sudden we went, So last year in our proxy statement, we very clearly called them out as ESG metric, same metrics. Now we're good. So safety, customer satisfaction, employee diversity, those have been in there for 15 years. But we are now recognizing that we have to disclose them differently so that we are appropriately calling attention to them. And again, these are all things that we discuss with our board. And literally just a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about the measurement issue and the use of third parties and how we are going to do that, how we then link that with our audit firm. So it is a very hot topic at the board level and in our committees right now.
Thank you. So Ulyss, as chair of the comp committee, I'd love to get your thoughts on it, because I know a lot of comp committees are trying to figure out how to exercise the appropriate oversight on compensation plans. It's getting a lot of play in the press as well. And not just from the WEC Energy Board, but also, your manpower, which is all about talent and people, supporting other companies. I'd love to get your thoughts about that.
I think they always go back to the axiom, you can't manage what you can't measure. And so I think I would start there, even on compensation, is we need improved data capture to be able to determine, what the metrics should be, and therefore how did the management perform vis-a-vis those metrics. And without having that, the EPS is easy, right? Even diversity numbers, as Morgan said, easy to know. But I think that's the first challenge, right? Getting that improved data capture so you know what data you're looking at and how meaningful is the data. And I would just, maybe I'm not answering your question directly, but I was just thinking of different things. I listened to Peggy, and I've been on the comp committee there, maybe, I don't know, 10 years or so, chaired it the last year and a half. And we feel a pull to be more granular. In other words, information is power. And we have consultants who help us, but that's part of our job as a comp committee to make sure we're getting this great data. But often every company is a little different. Like I said, we're in 4 states, and we have rate cases in 4 different states. They give us a allowed return on equity, which our shareholders expect us to get it, right? But this goes beyond the return on equity, and again, what should that measurement really be? I think I'll listen to Paula talk about sustainability, right? For our shareholders, one would say, well, look, you meet your return or allowed return on equity, and that's what we want to see. And if we do that, your total shareholder return should show that. On the other hand, we know that our challenge on our goal on renewables, we've got coal, natural gas, and renewables. Well, back in the day, we were moving from coal to go to natural gas. But nowadays, the view on natural gas is, hey, that's not so good either. And yet, when you go to renewables, we find the question of sustainability. In some of our markets, we've monitored it. We have a Midwest market where all the producers put their power into a regional network called MISO, and they determine, basically what we're going to get paid for and how much we should generate. And we saw times where effectively, if we projected out, if the renewable level had been attained, we had a question of reliability. And that's a challenge too, right? Is because for utility, we want to make sure we have a sustainable, affordable system of power generation and distribution that attracts companies, employment, population growth. I mean, Paul talked about in San Antonio when they first started the system where it was versus where it is today. So that's on our mind as well. And our regulators, who are often appointed by elected officials, which vary from administration to administration, they move the bar as well. So I would just say that again, it's a moving target. For us, the challenge is improved data capture. What data is meaningful to us, to our shareholders? To some degree, we listen to them. Peggy reports back, tells us what they're thinking. To the extent we can adjust the dials, we do. But more importantly, as a utility, we have to have sustainable power for the people who we serve in our market. And while we'll listen, and clearly we've got our path to net zero in the meaningful way, but I'm not sure how people feel if International Falls, Minnesota, you go to 50% renewables, it's the coldest place in North America, how they really feel about the net zero policy. So again, it's a question of improved data, figuring out what the data is telling us, and what's the right level as we go towards our net zero program.
It's a balance, and it's also just a moving target, as you indicate, because everything's changing so fast. One other thing in reference, Morgan, to the PwC survey that came out, alongside that report that they issued, was how well do boards of directors today understand the various areas of oversight, in connection with ESG. And so some companies are, looking for ESG experts, much like there was the whole move for cyber experts on boards. Some boards have created ESG committees. and others have just allocated the responsibility among the board themselves. But getting to your point of oversight, I'd be curious to get your thoughts. Obviously, you all understand the issues. So present company would be excluded, but in this survey that was done this year, just 25% of directors say their board really understands ESG risks. Maybe I need to get Gina to go out and proselytize with them. But
You'll have to find a clone. You'll have to find a clone. She's ours.
Exactly. But I'd be curious, and Peggy in particular, because you mentioned that you don't have an ESG committee, but you do focus on how you allocate the responsibility. We've just heard from Ulyss about compensation, but how you measure it, how you monitor it, or how the audit committee has to sort of take hold of their responsibility relative to it. And the governance committee, I think people would be interested in that, because that's part of sort of, it's more than just the mechanics. It really gets to what the Delaware courts are really reminding us of, that boards of directors have, much more stringent oversight requirements than we've seen in the past, and that rigor needs to be applied to it. So just your comment on that as a follow-up to what you had.
Can I make a quick point after Peggy
Sure.
answers, please? After Peggy answers.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'll be quick, Morgan, because I want to hear what you have to say. Maybe you'll have some more true confessions for us. So I would say, and our executive chair would be very happy to hear me say this. We are not a fan, if I can put it this way, of what I'll call single issue directors. And we really try very hard to look across at our competency matrix and figure out, yes, where we may need some additional help, but we don't have an ESG committee because frankly, we don't think we need one. And we think that our current committee structure is managing each of the areas from an oversight perspective that they should be, that their charters have always required them to be responsible for. We very clearly, if you look at, for example, our climate report and others, we disclose under TCFD standards, and governance is one of them. And we very carefully lay out there what the role of the full board is versus each of its committees versus management as it relates to things like climate. And we feel very strongly that if there are issues that could impact the long-term sustainability of the company, that generally speaking are strategic in nature, those belong to the full board. That we want the full board, we want the benefit of the full board's direction, oversight, as Ulyss said before, we want them all rolling around in these issues. Climate change is one of those for utility. So we very intentionally have kept climate change and strategy related thereto at the full board level, but we then carve out certain aspects of environmental, certain aspects of workforce management, et cetera, to the various committees where we think they can get into the nitty gritty and the details a bit. But what we then do as management is we recognize our role in assisting the board in becoming educated. So just to give you an example, at just a couple of weeks ago when we had our meeting, we had a deep dive session where we heard not only from essentially the investor community, our board could hear from them, could ask questions, but also from technical experts in our space who could talk about things like game-changing technology. What is coming your way? How should you feel about things like using hydrogen? Battery storage, you hear all about it. How does that connect to the company's strategy, even from a timing point of view? And we bring these experts in to help the board and management ensure that we're not setting pie in the sky goals, that they actually make sense. And the board's role is oversight, and it is not to manage the company, and they hold us accountable to manage the company, but we need to make sure that they have what they need to oversee. And so that's where we provide the education, and we make sure that each of the committees and the board understands what we think their role is, and they tell us if they think they should be doing something different. And
holding them accountable to achieving that in a consistent way. That's smart. Morgan, especially because lead is really game-changing technology.
So I'm trying not to be too esoteric, but I focus on what Euless was saying, and I just want to emphasize from the point of view of governance, just what a challenge it is that the system we have, and thank God for the system, essentially for-profit corporations, investor-owned utilities are running basically 80% of the electric grid. And of course, they operate with the same motivation that every other for-profit corporation does, of getting a return for shareholders. At the same time, maybe without thinking it through fully, society, us, also ratepayers, but us, say, here are the goals you're going to have to meet for reduction of carbon emissions. And here's 2030, here's 2050, and it would be great if you hurried up. Connecting, oh, and by the way, it's unthinkable that if we walk over and flip that switch, there isn't power, abundant power to run every one of our devices. Thinking through, I would say I'm a wireless expert and climbing the steep curve, understanding the utility business, but the problems confronting the utility industry, the complexity of where policy and capital and public-private partnership, almost every buzzword you can come up with, focuses on how these industries and you know, the IOUs are 80%, but Paula and the co-ops and the municipals are similarly challenged. But as a society, and this gets back to the governance, we have to figure it out. We have to figure out, how are we going to keep the structure but meet the goals? And if we don't have a tremendous amount of innovation and huge amounts of capital, we're fooling ourselves. So I mean, we look at that challenge every day. We want to play a small part in trying to address it, but it's everybody's problem. And we're so conscious of the challenges, and wow, you have to be brave to be in that space.
Just before we go to lightning round, I want to turn to Paula, because obviously as a municipally owned utility, you have other challenges related to how you go about having oversight on your board and working with management in connection with that. And obviously the ratepayers are a significant pressure in connection with that as well. Be curious as your comments, just as we finish up on this concept of both measurement and oversight.
Actually, I also thank you for the opportunity to weigh in, and I wanted to tie back a bit to both Peggy and Morgan's comments, because our board is a bit different. It is self-perpetuating. I mean, the board picks the candidates, but to Peggy's point, when we look at these issues, it's a small board. So we have by statute, it can only have 5 members, which is tough. So they have to break up every single thing, whether it be technology, audit, pension benefits, operational oversight. They're very small committees, 2 people. But back to this issue, ESG is so big. What they've done is they have these subcommittees that are, and every subcommittee is in a risk alignment that goes up through the subcommittee to the board. But in the case of ESG, the committee, the board actually serves as the risk committee. To Peggy's point, it's too big. And while we love, like, management can bring its expertise and we can hire more people, the board can actually hire consultants to give them any level of expertise that they need. but we really do need every board member thinking about from their level of expertise, this bigger issue. So I just wanted to be able to say that regardless of whether you're investor owned or municipal or co-op, this is that big of a deal that you really want the expertise of your entire board. And to Morgan's point, you want to completely lean into it. You want to, you can't assume, for example, that it will be something that you can be responsive to, which is difficult. Utility business is built primarily to respond to things. I mean, we're long-term planners. Unlike investor-owned municipal utilities can't take a much longer view because we're not quarterly reporting our earnings status. But ultimately, we also are trying to balance, how to make these long-term investments and make everything work. And I wanted to tie just one more comment in here. One of the questions that was in this space is, basically asking questions like, people are indicating that the investments into this ESG are poor returns, right? I mean, in other words, you're putting in more money, but whether or not you see a bottom line financial stability as quickly as, for example, if you were just putting in a new power plant, that return has a longer term challenge. And so accordingly, is it deficient? Does it lack in superiority and drive? But I would tell you that I oftentimes, when I think about it, I think about when I was in college and you had to play the game in teams. And eventually you figured out that the people who made investments back then into marketing and market research, even more so research, were the bigger drivers and the winners in that game. And I really believe, as we were talking about opportunity, and this is why it's so big for the entire board, to not assume that you're looking at the next quarter or the next year. You're looking at these big goals about people leaning in now, and you may not see immediate return, but you can't be the last person to this investment. You've got to put the money into these policies, into this innovation, be it hydrogen or some other new chemistry in terms of storage. You got to do that, and you got to lean into it, and you can't wait. You can't be reactive like you would to a storm, right? We can restore a storm. We know how to do that all day long. We can repair a power plant all day long. We can go fix a grid when there's some type of breakdown all day long. But these are investments that are more qualitative, and they have to be made now because you can't catch up to the years that you're supposed to be investing in this ESG and taking on more risk. You're taking on more risk that you really don't know what technology is going to win, but you better be thinking about aged power plants, disruption, the pressures again from customers who have a higher expectation of whether or not you are even actively putting in decisions that keep you cleaner and keep you thinking about that innovation. So that's why, again, I'd say, you want to have every single board member, bringing in their expertise, whether it be from technology, operations, policy, legal, all those things that are out there. They need to put a ESG lens. And the big risk, and I'll end with this, the big risk is the risk of doing nothing is what you always have to put in front of you. If you do nothing and I'm going to play it safe, there really is this big emerging risk that you're going to miss. The real thing is put your intellectual capital about, I think I can mitigate my exposure and take opportunity. And from my perspective, the way that we build a better strategy is to add this dimension or that dimension. And again, a board can do that with management, again, thinking about applied strategy along the way.
Clint, over to you.
Thank you, Gail. This has been such an amazing discussion. I'm riveted. I'm having trouble switching gears, but so great job, Gail and panel. We're going to now turn to our famous lightning round, where we just ask each of the panelists very quickly in just a couple of sentences to convey the most important theme they would like for the audience to go away with on the subject of ESG. And we're going to reverse the order. And Euless, why don't we start with you, then Peggy, then Morgan, and then Paula.
Thank you, Clint. I guess in a nutshell, I would say that this is the reality we live in today, and it's driven by the young people who will live beyond us, right? And so we can, I would encourage all of us on the call to sort of disregard sort of our windshield, our point of view, and to seek others' points of view, because we're learning as we go, again, building the plane as we fly it. But the planet, people and prosperity and governance are real. We just sort of capsulize it now. But the first thing is accepting the fact that this is new, and it's being driven by others beyond ourselves, and to accept it. Because once you realize that, then you're able to make a difference. Then you're able to set policy. Then you're able to measure performance. But if you come to the table with our own windshield, it's very hard to see to see the road ahead. And I'm one of those old dinosaurs too, in that sense, that I thought what I learned, is the truth. To some degree it is, but some degree it's not. So I just encourage all of us to remember that this is a moving target as we go, and to accept the fact that certain assumptions we had, we believed in, were wrong. And that there's new assumptions out there, and that we shouldn't feel we've got it licked.
Thank you, Euless. Terrific message. Peggy, let's call on you next.
Yeah, thank you, Clint. I would say, to me, I'm waiting for ESG to morph into some other acronym, because I've always been a little perplexed, I guess, particularly as a general counsel and corporate secretary, about the G in there with the E and the S in this way, because the G is the anchor of ESG. Without a strong G, there can be no cohesive, accountable approach to E, S, or anything else. And so ESG, if you think about it that way, is really at its core all about sustainability. And that term has come up somewhat in this discussion, but I mean sustainability in the broad sense of the word. And so when you look at sustainability, we've defined it in identifying our priority sustainability issues as the way our company balances economic, environmental, and social issues and decisions to support the long-term viability of our business, the community, and the environment. So you'll see governance is not mentioned in there because it can't happen without it. And from my point of view, the board must view its oversight role, and I'm proud that ours does, in the ESG space in a very similar light as the way it does to anything else that it oversees.
Perfect long distance guidance. Thank you, Peggy. Morgan.
Clint, and fellow screeners. I think we're living in a time in which capitalism is confronting unprecedented challenges to its basic principles. And ESG, and I may be with Peggy on maybe not loving what it's called, but those principles, when properly embraced by business and inserted into capitalism, will save it. And that's what we're living through, the early stages of bloodless disruption, reinvention of capitalism. And I'm with Euless. It's not going to be our generation. Oh, wait a minute. No, Peggy's young. It's going to be Peggy leading, and Gail, of course. The rest of us will be watching from the sidelines. But and so the challenge is capitalism up to it? Are we going to hand off businesses that are going to be able to accomplish that?
Brilliant, provocative. Thank you, Morgan. And Paula, we'll give you the last word on this, and then I think we'll have just time for maybe one or two quick questions from the audience.
Well, I want to, talk a little bit about some of the audience participation. I think the questions were amazing and could in many ways be dimensions of additional follow-on conversations. But a couple of them that have kind of been relevant here are about streamlining the reporting and what the reporting really means. And can you say no to all the demands of reporting and all that? The one thing I want to highlight is reporting, financial reporting, and very much ESG reporting is to external parties, as much as Peggy talked about, you got to be very, very thoughtful, and it takes a long time to do it. You have to wait till your measurements are done, and it's historical in the rearview mirror. I think one of the problems that every entity has is there isn't enough standardization. And I think we should have more standardization, but I'm a little worried about it because, again, every single entity, let alone every single industry, has a different journey it must take in its role to get to net zero emissions. So even if we could standardize the reporting, you have to remember that not everybody's coming with the same maturity timeline to get there. Yes, we know 2050, 2040, 2030, but your path to do that you may be able to accelerate the beginning, you may be able to accelerate some other part of the timeline. All those things matter. I just would suggest that we got to get this thing down, and now we don't think about financial reporting as a barrier. We just need to do it. But I think it's much more important to be engaged in the real-time strategic discussion about how we're making today's decisions. We'll report on it, next year, but today's decisions, and really watching a company and the position and the positions and strategies they're trying to deploy that really matter as they're making that journey. So yes, I know we're talking about the discipline behind it and the commitment. But again, I'm worried about we'll be looking in the rearview mirror when in fact we really need to be making some real time advancement, working with customers, stakeholders, and the last point I would say is, again, the problem I see is that we're also seeing people bring their politics inside of this discussion, and some people believe that the reason why it's so slow, and probably is it's just too political. You either can do it because you believe in climate change or you're a climate denier. And I would say this thing is bigger than politics. Again, this is about how our children and children's children will enjoy the planet. And we need to make sure that I believe we need to get all, both sides need to come a bit more to the center so we can focus on that progress and then tell our story along the way. So those are my thoughts.
Perfect. Practical way to wrap up this really engaging, wonderful discussion. We will have, I'm just going to ask one question now. We're running pretty close to our time limit, but, and you have anticipated a lot of the questions. Also, Dorinda has shared our website information in the chat room. If there are other requests for documents or information that we have not provided, just send us an email, and Dorinda and Gail and I will work on getting you a response. Let me just ask for a really, really quick response. Paula began to anticipate this question from Shannon Brush, which is, what conversations are being had about streamlining ESG reporting? Do you feel empowered to say no to some, given the resources needed for each? Terrific question. Peggy, do you want to take a shot at it? Great.
And I guess this is going to sound very lawyerly, but I guess to the latter part of the question, it depends on who's asking. So sometimes we can say no, sometimes we can't, but there is a real kind of groundswell movement afoot to try to do some of what Paula was flagging is the real problem. I mean, there is a cottage industry in most large companies these days, just trying to keep up with all of the surveys coming our way, and it's unsustainable. So you will, I think, start seeing some breakdown. We're already seeing it happen as certain surveying companies are buying others, et cetera, et cetera. But trade industries can also help, or trade groups. So in our case, the electric and gas trade groups got together and came out with some of their own reporting metrics, which has really helped us because then we all report into that. And so I would encourage folks to also lean on those trade groups and then try to encourage your shareholders to the extent you can not to come up with one-off surveys for you.
Peggy, extremely helpful guidance yet again. And Gail, let me thank you again and our really, really exceptional panel today. This was even beyond my expectations, which were very high. So we're going to give each of you a quiet ovation and our deep thanks on behalf of the audience. And we will see you all soon. Terrific job.
Thank
Bye
you.
now.